Hello, everyone, and welcome into a very special edition of DawgNation Daily today. My name is Brandon Adams. As you can see, at least for those of you watching on video, we're in a unique setting. We're live at East Lake Country Club, where in 3 weeks' time, this beautiful course, one of the crown jewels in all the state of Georgia, if not all the world, is going to host the Tour Championship, the final event of the season for the PGA Tour. It's championship, if you will, with a whole bunch of money on the line and a whole bunch of big-time golf stars fighting for one last opportunity at fame and glory as part of the 2019 golfing year. We'll talk more about that over the course of our show, including how you can be a part of it with a very special discount. We'll do that as we continue here today on DawgNation Daily. But obviously, you come to this program for a little Georgia football talk, and make no mistake about it, there will be plenty of that today. Let me give you an idea of some of the stuff that's coming up on the program. Later on today, we'll hear from John Stinchcomb, the great former Georgia Bulldog, who's a part of our Own the East season preview series. We'll talk today about some of those 2018 signees that could make a big impact this season. This conversation is more relevant now, despite the fact that we recorded the video a couple of weeks ago, and obviously at that time, Brenton Cox was still on this roster. The attention that's been paid to the 2018 class this week because of the apparent departure of Cox makes this, as I said before, not just a important conversation, but one that's also a lot of fun as we look at some of the other members of that class that might get their time to shine here this season. And along those lines, I'll invite you to check out my piece at DawgNation.com, where I went into even more detail about what might happen for those guys this season as the jockeying for playing time and position on the depth chart continues here this week at Georgia Practice. Now, speaking of Georgia Practices, also coming up in just a couple of moments, we're going to talk to Mike Griffith. Now, normally when we're on the road, we can't take the phone calls and some of the technical stuff that we do back when we're in the friendly confines of our DawgNation World Headquarters studios, but Mike was good enough to sit with me for a few minutes yesterday for a never-before-heard conversation about what Mike has already observed at Georgia Practices, and I think you're going to like this one a lot because a couple of the names that come up, the latest on Zamir White, a very, very interesting look at freshman defensive back Tyreek Stevenson. I think the defensive back situation for Georgia is a very interesting conversation that I believe that Kirby Smart thinks he's got a better crop of defensive backs than maybe some of the national media think. We'll talk more about that with Mike Griffith here coming up in just a couple of moments. Before that, though, there are a couple of things I want to turn your attention to that I've been reading, watching around DawgNation that I want to make sure that you're aware of, because I do think this is where the Georgia football conversation is going to center here at your water cooler or your back porch or watering hole, wherever you might go, over the course of the next 24 hours. I mentioned Mike Griffith a moment ago. He had a really good piece at DawgNation yesterday after having a chance to catch up with Georgia wide receiver Tyler Simmons. There was a quote in particular from Simmons that really caught my eye, and I'm imagining if you read the piece or if you saw the video that was posted on the DawgNation video channels, including our YouTube page, I'm imagining this kind of caught your eye there as well. If you missed it, let me just read a couple of sentences to you of what Simmons said to Mike and the other reporters who were in the room yesterday at the conclusion of Georgia practice. Simmons says about this Georgia offense, you're going to see a completely different offense this year, and it's really going to be fun. It's going to be an exciting offense, and I'm hoping everybody will enjoy that. I guess pressed a little bit more about exactly what that might mean. Simmons went on to talk about the idea that there could be a few more balls in the air this season. We have talked about this, obviously, a lot over the course of the last few months. And hearing Simmons say what he says there reminds me of something that Charlie Warner, the Georgia tight end, also said during spring practice. At that time, we were still getting acclimated to the idea that Georgia had a new offensive coordinator, James Coley, taking the place of Jim Chaney, who's now at Tennessee. And Warner, during spring practice, when he talked about his perception of how things might be different for Coley than it was for Jim Chaney, also said that he thinks that Coley's intuition is to maybe pass a little bit more, that he's maybe more of a pass-first offensive coordinator than maybe Jim Chaney was a year ago. And if you're a regular watcher or listener to DawgNation Daily, you know that I met that Werner remark with a little bit of skepticism. I'm of the belief that the real architect of the Georgia offense, with no disrespect to its previous offensive coordinator or its current offensive coordinator, I'm of the belief that the real architect of this offense is Kirby Smart. And it's Kirby Smart who set the run-pass balance where it is, obviously predominantly favoring the run by about almost, a 2-to-1 margin. So when Werner says what he says, my first instinct is to discount that at least just a little bit for a tight end that hopes to be on the receiving end of some of those passes. My assumption that might be a degree of wishful thinking. And admittedly, when Tyler Simmons says what he says here, that's also my first instinct on that as well. However, there is a question, though, in the midst of all of this that's probably fair to ask. If Warner says this, if Simmons says this, assuming we may hear other guys in that receiving corps say this, maybe one of the Georgia quarterbacks will say this at some point in time. If the players keep saying this, then shouldn't we at least consider the possibility that it might turn out to be true? I think it's at least worth considering. Here's what I think is best for the Georgia offense. When it plays the teams it needs to beat most, those are the moments when the things that Simmons talks about, a few more balls in the air, a little more excitement, an entirely different thing than we've seen in the past, that's when you hope those things come out. Or in the one area in which Georgia consistently struggled a year ago, down near the goal line. I'm a believer that you're not going to maul and power your way to those touchdowns, not just inside the red zone. Georgia's problem a year ago was actually from the 10-yard line and in. Those are the moments when I hope the Georgia offense gets more creative. I mean, frankly, for most of the regular season games over the last 2 years that haven't been close, games here in 2019 that I don't expect to be all that close either, for most of those games, Georgia doesn't need to do anything differently than it's been doing in the past. But to be more effective offensively in the fourth quarter against a team like Alabama, to go head-to-head in a potential matchup with Clemson, to be able to match offensively what Clemson did to the Crimson Tide in the national championship game a year ago. Those are the moments when I hope that Simmons turns out to be right. I don't need it to be that way all 15 games. I don't think any fan necessarily does. But in those crucial moments down near the goal line of whatever game turns out to be close, or against the even competition that you'll face December throughout the end of the season, where you do expect those to be tightly contested, even matchups, equal talent on both sides. That's where a new dynamic, a new dimension to the James Coley offense, that's where that could really come in handy and play very well. Something else from yesterday that I wanted to take a mention of here as we're doing DawgNation Daily Live from Eastlake Golf Club ahead of the Tour Championship coming up in just a couple of weeks. The final event of the season for the PGA Tour. Brand new date for that. Very, very fun opportunity for those that like college football and golf. Something else I wanted to take a minute to mention on our program is also something else that a Georgia player talked about yesterday. And if you don't typically go to our video pages to check out the interviews that we do with Georgia players, if you simply wait and read their quotes at DawgNation.com, this might be a video you want to check out. Really fun stuff yesterday with Georgia offensive lineman Ben Cleveland. Cleveland is obviously one of the very interesting personalities on this Georgia roster. And one of the things that Cleveland followed up on yesterday was something that Andrew Thomas had talked about with him going back to SEC Media Days. He was asked to relay his funniest Ben Cleveland story. And for those of you that follow this team closely, you know what an interesting personality Cleveland is and how different he is, not just from most of the players in this Georgia roster, but really most of the players in all of college football. He's the kind of guy that carries a knife around with him everywhere he goes. He talked about that. Andrew Thomas has talked about that before. You can go back to the early days of DawgNation when Cleveland was still a recruit coming out of Stevens County High School. Jeff Sintel, our recruiting insider, has talked about him shooting, deer, whatever else, with a bow and arrow off his back porch. I mean, this is a guy that essentially can cook and kill his own breakfast. This is a pretty unique guy, and it's really fun to think about how wide-ranging the personalities are on this Georgia offensive line. Cleveland, kind of the country boy, Andrew Thomas and Jamar Salyer, they go to a fancy private school in the city, and really kind of everything else in between. And somehow, some way, this group has found some cohesion. I think you have to give Sam Pittman a lot of credit about that. And it was fun to hear Cleveland talking about his own unique personality a little bit yesterday. But something else that Cleveland said also got my attention. I always think it's interesting to hear these guys reflect on what it's like to battle the person across from them during practice. And one of the names that Cleveland was asked about was Jordan Davis, the mammoth nose tackle, a part of the Georgia defense. And one of the things that Cleveland said about Davis, and I think this matters, he praised him for the physical conditioning he's showing right now. Obviously, when you weigh in the neighborhood of 330 pounds, it can be very easy for 330 to turn into 350 or 360, and those extra 20, 30 pounds not being the kind of good weight, the kind of weight that's easily managed on the field, that can affect your conditioning. It sounds like right now Cleveland's not seeing that from Jordan Davis, and I know it's the oldest cliche in the book, but the whole notion of iron sharpening iron, good players making other good players better during practice. Boy, when you hear Cleveland talk yesterday about Davis and you hear the other things that are being said about not just the battles for playing time within position groups, but the battles across the line of scrimmage against the the opposite position group, you really get a sense that this Georgia practice right now is setting this team up to do what it wants to do. Kirby Smart has preached over and over again about doing more in the upcoming season. That obviously starts with how you perform in practice, and it seems like Georgia could be on its way to doing just that. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily. We're the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We are normally inside of our DawgNation World headquarters. Today, we are out and about and happy to be at East Lake Country Club, getting ready for the Tour Championship coming up in a couple of weeks. As I said before, I'm going to tell you later on about a very special discount you have a chance to take advantage of, and I will invite you to enjoy what's going to be an awesome golf event coming up just 3 weekends from right now. You'll hear more about that over the course of our program. For now, though, let me thank our video audience, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio with my friends at Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, or podcast on all the different platforms, Apple, Google. We post the show at the world-famous DawgNation.com. We are really happy to have you with us today. We'll hear from John Stinchcomb later on as part of our Own the East season preview. We'll hear from Mike Griffith coming up in just a couple of minutes, too. Before that, though, let me go around the doghouse, and it's today presented by my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. I've gotten a lot of feedback about something that happened on DawgNation Daily yesterday. Jeff Sentell was a part of our program, and I, as you might imagine, asked Jeff about some of the recruiting rumors that have been out there over the course of the last couple of days. This probably all starts because four-star running back Tank Bigsby made it be known over the weekend that this Friday he plans to announce his commitment. When I asked Jeff, point blank yesterday was, based on everything that is seemingly out there in the, as I like to say, the online chatter right now, it's difficult to imagine that Bigsby's coming to Georgia. And at one point in time, that wasn't quite so difficult to imagine. At one point in time, you heard Kendall Milton talking about Bigsby a lot, praising Bigsby in equal measure to what he would say about Zachary Evans, the five-star running back. But subsequent to that, when Georgia hosted a big recruiting weekend a couple of weeks ago, Bigsby wasn't there. Zachary Evans was. Bigsby was reportedly at Auburn. And now with the commitment announcement coming up so shortly after that, the tea leaves seem to suggest that Bigsby's not going to Georgia. If you had to pick anywhere, if you're going to make an online prediction about this, you'd probably say Auburn is the spot for him. Well, Jeff answered that question directly yesterday, saying yes, that's what he believes the likely scenario is, which sets us up, I believe, then for an even more interesting conversation. What does that then mean for all the other stuff that Georgia recruits have said here over the course of the last couple of days? Remember Monday's show? We talked about Kendall Milton's tweet about how Georgia fans were going to thank him later for the work that he had been doing on the recruiting trail. Chad Lindbergh kind of cryptically became a part of this discussion as well, saying, y'all aren't ready for what's about to happen. And people like me who openly speculate for a living, sometimes even make wild guesses, people like me who openly speculate for a living, when you see Milton saying that that Georgia fans are going to thank him later, and knowing that Milton is a elite five-star running back and a friend of Zachary Evans, when you hear Lindbergh saying something to that similar effect, Lindbergh, a fellow Texan with Zachary Evans from the suburban Houston area, all of a sudden the imagination starts going wild a bit, and you start thinking, wait, is Bigsby going to commit elsewhere on Friday because Georgia thinks it's got Zachary Evans? Is that what Kendall Milton was referencing? Is that what Chad Lindbergh was referencing? Throw Tate Ratledge into this discussion for good measure, who also had his own version of this tweet. And if you listen to yesterday's show, here's what you know. When I posed that question to Jeff Sentell, he wasn't quite as willing to answer that one directly and on the record. But I think it's fair to say that he didn't do a whole lot to shoot down the possibility that's what they could have been referencing. We've been saying this now for a while. The end of July, turning the calendar over to August, where a lot of these high school seasons are getting ready to begin. Practices are certainly have started for college teams, and high school teams are in the midst of that as well for many of these guys. It's a focus on what they hope is going to be a great senior season. Just the evolution of the calendar kind of stirs up a little bit of drama. And for the moment, Georgia is right in the middle of all the drama when it comes to elite running backs. I'd love to be able to tell you with great certainty I know what Zachary Evans is going to do. The truth is, I'm not quite sure, speaking as a fan just for a moment, I'm not quite sure what it would take for me to confidently believe that Georgia is going to take this one all the way down to the wire, the December signing date, and actually, if it were to get the commitment, hold on to it. I think this is a recruitment personally that's far from over, and I think this is a recruitment that's heavily contested. But the good news is right now it seems that UGA is right in the thick of all of that competition, and we'll certainly talk more about this on Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger, which comes up a little bit later on today. For now, though, that's Around the Doghouse, presented by my friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. You know, I say all the time that ESOG is a solutions-based company. That means when it comes to some of the issues you may be facing around your house, waterproofing stuff, foundation issues. You see those weird sort of horizontal cracks, the diagonal cracks, that can be kind of a scary thing. Well, if it's a simple fix, and oftentimes it is, then Engineered Solutions of Georgia is going to tell you exactly what you need to do just to get this thing fixed easy, and you can go about your life. Sometimes, though, the solutions are a lot more complicated than that. That's also why you want to turn to ESOG. They have 2 full-time engineers on staff, smart people to do good work for you. So if you're facing a foundation issue or a waterproofing issue, you got water in your basement, moisture creeping in, that affects the structural integrity of your home. So don't wait to reach out by phone. Simply dial 678-ESOG now. That number, once again, 678-ESOG now. It's great to have Engineered Solutions of Georgia as a part of Around the Doghouse. It's great to have you with us as a part of DawgNation Daily as we're live at East Lake Country Club. We'll have more on the big golf event coming up later on. For now, though, with a deeper look at what's going on at UGA practices, let's talk to our buddy Mike Griffith here as a part of DawgNation Daily.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
DawgNation Daily on the road today. That means not able to catch up with Mike Griffith on the phone. So Mike, good enough to catch up with us prior to us coming out here today. So we'll enjoy that conversation as we look back on what has already happened in a pretty busy series of days involving Georgia practices. Mike, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate you being with us, and we appreciate your insight about what has happened on the practice field for the Dogs thus far.
Oh, no doubt. It's been a great start to fall camp for Georgia BA. I know there's been some attrition and a few people wringing the hands, but the mood, the business-like setting, the edge that you can just feel going to fan day, watching Kirby and the players interact with fans, just get a real good vibe off this team.
So I obviously want to talk to you about all of that. Let me start, though, with something you've recently written at DawgNation.com, kind of an interesting look at freshman defensive back Tyreek Stevenson. I think that Stevenson's a really interesting name on this roster, just given how impressive he was coming out of high school. Obviously, we have some question marks about that starter opposite Eric Stokes at the cornerback position. Maybe Tyson Campbell has the inside track on that because Campbell started some last year, but you get the impression that Stevenson maybe heard from a little bit too. What did you make of the things that defensive coordinator Dan Lanning had to say about Stevenson the other day, what you've personally seen from Stevenson yourself, and kind of how you think he fits into this defensive back rotation at the moment?
Yeah, it's in line with what I saw this summer. It sounds crazy, but just watching a guy play dodgeball and dunk at Camp Sunshine, you could just tell he was, he's Tyreek the Freak. I mean, the nickname fits. The athleticism and the size, 6'1", 210, explosive. The quick cat-like quickness, the movements. And Kirby had had alluded to him in spring drills more than once. And that kind of, when the head coach throws a name out there just randomly and he's not asked about him, that was kind of telling. So everything I had heard about Tyreek Stevenson kind of fit what Lanning said. And holy moly, we got a ball player here. And, that he was very productive in spring drills. And, to your point, yes, Tyson Campbell and Eric Stokes are the experienced corners, and you got to think they're going to get first run. But, you play these teams that play 4 and 5 receiver sets, you got to have more DBs out there. You got to have more packages. So I expect to see number 7 on defense making some plays this season.
You mentioned the confidence that Kirby Smart seemed to have going back to spring practice, or just some of the things that Smart said during spring practice. I do think it's kind of interesting that because all these guys were able to go through that spring, you know how it is, Mike. If you're a freshman like Stevenson, you're trying to play, then having the not game experience, but experience around the program, certainly experience during practice, that a spring practice can provide, I think that's an incredible springboard. And I do think it speaks to the fact that Kirby Smart might like this secondary group right now a little bit better than maybe some of the national media might think, or some of the folks who think they follow college football closely might realize, because of the fact that he's had his hands on these guys dating back to the spring, because many of them, even the ones we haven't seen play yet, are pretty prodigious from a prospect standpoint, recruiting standpoint. I actually think Georgia probably feels a little better about its secondary than some people might realize. Would you agree with that?
I think they feel a lot better about their secondary than they did last year. And you say, well, how can that be? They lost a first-round pick. Well, three other guys got better. Really more than three other guys, probably 5 or 6 or 7. And then, as you said, you add to the mix of DJ Daniel and Tyreek Stevenson. There's a lot of talent back there and returning starters. I think most importantly, Richard LeCounte and J.R. Reed. That safety duo, I think Kirby feels that much better about them, and that's really what enables him to do so much more up front is when he feels like that secondary is locked in and able to disguise some things and his assignment sound and feels good about both those cornerbacks. So I look at the secondary as a real position of strength, and I thought they were vastly underrated in some of those off-season rankings. I'm not so sure that Georgia doesn't have the best secondary in the SEC.
Now, on the other side of the ball with the wide receivers, this is where I will admit that I have probably more question marks. However, I'll also say that while I don't know which of these wide receivers from this group is going to emerge and become the guys on the field the most for Georgia, and of those guys on the field the most, I'm not 100% sure they're going to have the kind of sort of top-end performance that might be required to stand there alongside an Alabama and a Clemson. Mike, I do think this is a really fun story to watch right now. I think that there's a dynamic quality to George Pickens and to Dominic Blaylock and year 2 of Demetrius Robertson and the intrigue offered by Lawrence Cager transferring in from Miami. I don't know where this story ends, but I'll say it's a pretty fun story to follow for right now, and I'm assuming you probably agree with that.
Absolutely. I'll throw in the toughness of a Tyler Simmons and the potential of a Matt Landers, but I'm not so sure that DeAndre Swift isn't the best receiver on the team right now. I think we're going to see Swift do a lot, and there's a lot of other running backs that can do big things, and Kirby's got to manage his workload, but between Swift and Cook, I just get the feeling there's going to be a lot of high percentage throws, and then, of course, underneath. I know everyone's pointing to Charlie Werner, but it was Eli Wolf that tested out the strongest and the fastest of the Georgia tight ends, and he's hungry for opportunity after being overlooked at Tennessee for that number 1 JUCO transfer last year. So there's a lot of intrigue with where the ball will go and who will step up. And I, like you, don't have a very firm idea on who the leading receiver on this team will be at this stage.
Along those lines, though, hearing from James Coley yesterday, I thought there were some interesting things that he said, in particular the idea that in a pro-style offense, you're designing things for the players, not necessarily the plays. In other words, they're going to try to maximize the talent they do have. What does that mean to you, and how do you think, based on your best abilities to translate, how do you think that might turn what we see from Coley's offense into something a little bit different than we saw from Chaney in previous years?
Well, I think it has more to do with Jake Fromm being a third-year quarterback and the mastery that he has of the playbook and the ability that he has to teach in the huddle and to work with these receivers. I think that makes it a little bit more realistic that you could put a young freshman out there. And, boy, you're right. Wouldn't it have helped if Dominic Blaylock could have gone through spring drills at this stage? But he couldn't, and he didn't. He chose not to. But I do think that what Coley was saying was basically that if these guys are good enough, they're going to find their way on the field. And they'll simplify to the extent that they need to. There are some advantages to having more experienced guys out there, but if you got a guy like George Pickens that you could send on the field and tell him to run by everybody and out-jump somebody for the football, you're going to put him out there. And, we've got to wait and see, how these freshmen respond in pads. They'll have a great opportunity. Again, they'll be going up against prime-time future NFL players in that Georgia secondary in these scrimmages. And, that's where it's going to be decided. Lawrence Cager at 6'5" and 220, great hands and a great catch radius, but B.A., can he separate? Is he fast enough to get away from anybody? That's a question there. Demetrius Robertson, he's improved a great deal, but has he improved enough when he matches up against that press coverage? And Tyler Simmons played with the shoulder brace. Now that he's 100%, exactly what does he offer? I know he's a favorite of Kirby and, in fact, will be made available to the media. So there's a lot to look for there. There's a lot to read between the lines. But ultimately, the proof's going to be in the pudding, and these guys are going to sort it out on the practice field in these next 2 scrimmages.
There's been a lot of attention given to Zamir White's status. Kirby Smart gave some good news about that on Friday, at least ahead of a full contact scrimmage situation. He's cleared to be out there, and I guess from your own vantage point, what you've seen from him, does he look like a healthy running back in the brief window of time that the media gets to view practice?
Well, absolutely. I think the tone with Zamir is guardedly optimistic. When you're coming off of 2 non-contact ACL injuries, all anyone can do is pray and hope for the best that that it's in the plan for you to play football. Certainly, Zamir White has done everything, beyond everything, that's been required in this rehabilitation. And he's got the right attitude. He's got the right reproach. He's got the support of his coaches, his teammates, the prayers of the Georgia fans. I mean, everything is behind him. But again, another situation where until he's put through those contact practices, you don't know. And if you're Georgia, you don't necessarily want to rush it. It's not like you want to give him 25 carries in the first scrimmage and find out. You want it to be a gradual build-up because you're aware that, as confident as Zamir may be in those workout videos, it's very normal and, in fact, expected for there to be some collateral damage psychologically. And it takes a little bit of time to get back in that comfort zone. Lawrence Cager talked a lot about that with me this summer, about how his first year back, he thought he was back, but he wasn't really. There were times and there were doubts that crept in, and it's not the same for everyone. But if you're Georgia, you've got such a deep stable of running backs that you're not in a hurry to rush Zamir back. I think you're going to see him brought back gradually, BA, and get more and more carries as the season progresses in an optimal situation.
There were news reports yesterday, UGA Sports, I guess, first in on this, that Brenton Cox was dismissed from the Georgia roster. I know, Mike, you've been able to confirm that he is also in the transfer portal as well. Not seen at practice yesterday. This would seem to suggest that Brenton Cox's time as a Georgia player is now done. What do you make of all this, what Georgia has with Cox no longer in the fold, and kind of what the Brenton Cox era, how it should be viewed at Georgia? What's your opinion on all that?
Well, it just goes to show you can, if you're a little bit off, you can be a lot off. And Brenton Cox came in as a 5-star prospect with great expectations, certainly with all the physical attributes. But he had some issues earlier in the year with DeAndre Walker. We saw that little sideline stat in the Middle Tennessee game when he wasn't willing to accept some tough love from a senior upperclassman, and then lo and behold, at the end of the year against Alabama, when Walker goes down, Brenton Cox is having the same issues in containment. Ultimately, it contributes to Georgia losing the SEC championship game because of the uncoachability factor. And then in the spring, there's the off-the-field incident with the misdemeanor charge, less than 1 ounce of marijuana found in his dorm room, 420, I guess. And you wondered, how does Brenton Cox respond to this? Because that's not an optimal start for anyone. And then, boom, here comes Jermaine Johnson and Nolan Smith playing the same position. And maybe they passed him by in the depth chart. There were also reports it was a mutual parting of ways. So what was it? I'm not sure, but it's a tale of what can happen when you get a little off track. It's a tale that there's no sure thing despite a star ranking, and it's a tale that, in addition to having the right physical attributes, you've got to have the right you got to have some of the other attributes that go with it, and it's tough. It's a tough road to be at Georgia. I think Brenton Cox will probably learn from this and go on to another school and develop into a potentially a first-round draft pick. And listen, I saw the same thing happen at Michigan State with Montez Sweat. You might recall he was the premier pass rusher in the country last year, and I believe he still went in the first round, even though there might be a slight heart ailment. He went to Mississippi State and dominated. I saw Montez, a kid from Georgia, get recruited to Michigan State as a tight end and, have some issues and fail a substance test. And, boom, he's out of the program and appears at Mississippi State and goes on to greatness. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened for Brenton Cox. And you know what? It's not bad for Georgia, and it's not bad for Brenton. Sometimes kids need a fresh start. Sometimes they need to be somewhere else. Georgia's very deep at this position, Brandon, and I think Brenton got off to a bad start. And I think it's in everyone's best interest that he gets a fresh start somewhere.
I want to finish up our conversation with something a little bit off the beaten path. You were at Saturday at the Fan Day festivities that took place inside the UGA indoor practice facility. And leading up to Fan Day, Mike, there had been some chatter about the way in which this event has changed over the years, seemingly getting smaller. In the Kirby Smart era, there had been an open practice, an opportunity to see some things on the field, and then get a chance to get some autographs, picture, whatever, after that was done. This year was a little bit different. It was slated for an hour's worth of time inside the indoor facility. From having been there and seen this yourself from a first-person perspective, how do you think the fans responded to what was a little bit different version of Fan Day than we've kind of come to expect over the years at UGA?
I think the ones that were there were very pleased. And, they knew what they were going to get, and they were willing to accept that. And even though they said no pictures, there were pictures. The players weren't saying no, and neither was Kirby. I think that rule's in effect probably to protect the players and, prevent, somebody from an Alabama hat or something like that. I don't know. That's what I'm thinking. But it was a very loose, comfortable environment. I liked that it was in the indoor facility. I think that made it more comfortable for everybody. They weren't in the blazing sun. The players seemed relaxed. They were having fun with one another and fans. And, they were playing very positive, upbeat music in there, very festive, yet organized environment. So no complaints from my perspective. Now, I'm not someone that has gone to it, years and years before and maybe gotten spoiled by how it was done before. Certainly as a media member, I would have preferred a complete open practice. But, as I wrote that day, Kirby Smart is not leaving anything on the table when it comes to turning over every stone that gives his team a competitive advantage, whether we're talking about location of games, whether we're talking about time allotment for Fan Day, whether we're talking about an open practice where people might have an opportunity to see some of these young emerging weapons. He's leaving nothing to chance, and he's not wasting a minute on anything. And that's, I kind of picked that up yesterday when Dan Lanning spoke, and he said, Coach Smart's always telling me don't waste a minute. And I kind of thought, okay, that kind of falls in line with everything else that I'm seeing and hearing from Kirby Smart. And, as he said, 25-4 is not good enough. And so it's all about doing more. And, sometimes doing less is doing more, and doing less that's not directly involved in improving your team's chances of winning a title is doing more for that cause. So, Brandon, I think it's another piece and evidence of Kirby's mentality that he is going to make every doggone move it takes to get Georgia every single advantage. And, being the 3-2-1 recruiting class isn't good enough. He wants 1-1-1. Good's not good enough at Georgia anymore. I guess that's my message, and from what I'm interpreting from Kirby's actions.
Well, it's a fun conversation to have, Mike. We'll look forward to talking to you a whole lot more about these Georgia practices as they unfold. And back here again on DawgNation Daily, I'm sure very soon as well. Thanks so much for your time.
Appreciate it, B.A.
We're back live here at East Lake Country Club as a part of DawgNation Daily. Huge thanks to Mike Griffith for being a part of our program. That's become a Wednesday staple, especially this time of year. It's important to have that discussion with him, taking a look at everything that's been going on at UGA practice. Appreciate Mike doing that. By the way, dogs continue on this week, including more stuff coming up on Thursday. So make sure you keep it close to whether it be DawgNation.com, the DawgNation video channels for a whole lot more on that. By the way, speaking of DawgNation.com, go to the website today. Right there at the top, you'll see the banner to click in for Kroger. Kroger's got great back-to-school savings right now. Now, I know there's a whole host of counties that started school today. My kids have been in school now for a few days. Many of you kind of start in between times in on that. Well, if it's still those school supplies you need to get, the books, the paper, stuff like that, pencils, or if it's the stuff for the snacks or the stuff for the lunch, whatever else, the best way to save up, make sure you don't spend too much money this time of year, is right there with my friends at Kroger. And if you go to DawgNation.com, you can find out more about that, about how you can do some big-time savings there with my friends at Kroger. All right, we're going to have a whole lot more fun to come on video. We'll take a lot of your comments here coming up in just a little bit. Let me shift the conversation, though. The big news at Georgia has been the apparent dismissal of Brenton Cox, reported to be in the transfer portal, not seen at practice. It seems likely that his time at Georgia is done. Well, that dovetails into what we've been doing as part of our Own the East season preview. Now, for those of you who've been around for a while, you know that we've done now Own the East. This is our third straight year of doing that with our partner, Georgia's Own Credit Union. It's our way of looking at the upcoming season. And our belief around here is that Georgia fans want to win a national championship. Georgia fans want this year to finish on a happier, better note than what happened in 2018 and what happened in 2017. But the first step towards doing that is taking care of the business in your division. division, winning the SEC East again, setting yourself up for an SEC championship, and then everything that can happen beyond that. So that's why we do own the East with our friends at Georgia's own credit union. And one of the reasons I believe this year Georgia has a chance to own the East and a whole lot more is because of some of the guys that came in with Cox as part of that 2018 class. And yes, I know Brenton's apparently not here anymore. Luke Ford's gone. Justin Fields is gone. Leave some people to ask some questions about what the status of that former #1 class is. But there are still a whole lot of other guys from that group who could make big names for themselves this year. When you hear this conversation with John Stinchcomb, the one thing you're going to hear is John does mention Brenton Cox. That's simply because we recorded this before the Cox news came out. And the month of August always provides a few unexpected twists and turns like that. But nonetheless, when we think about those guys who may pop for Georgia this year, there are a lot of guys who are either redshirt freshmen or incoming freshmen who have a big chance to do just that. So I know you love my good friend John Stinchcomb, his analysis on UGA. You'll like him here as part of Own the East, presented by Georgia's own credit union as well. Hey Dog Nation, I'm Brandon Adams. It's time to do Own the East, brought to you by Georgia's own credit union, as we look how Georgia takes step one towards a championship, winning the division, maybe a whole lot more after that in 2019. With that in mind, let's bring in the great former Georgia All-American John Stinchcomb. And John, for every team in college football, and Georgia's no different, there's always some excitement about how the brand new crop of incoming freshmen might impact the outcome for a season. But in Georgia's case, when you look at certain players where, hey, freshmen could thrive, you also go back a year before that to the 2018 class, in some cases redshirt freshmen, in some cases rising sophomores. This was the #1 recruiting class in the country for 2018, and maybe for Georgia, a bigger question than the incoming freshmen are how those second-year guys have a big surge in their second year with the program. An example of that may be at outside linebacker. Lots expected of guys like Nolan Smith, the junior college transfer, Jermaine Johnson. But isn't it true that the spotlight should also be on guys like Adam Anderson and Brenton Cox and maybe a now healthy Azeez Ojulari as well? Shouldn't there be just as much attention on guys like that?
If not more. I think when you're looking at healthy teams, and you're probably not relying on a number of incoming freshmen to be your playmakers, and that's a good thing for Georgia because guys that came in-house last year, they've got one more year of practicing and learning the system, and that outside linebacker position is loaded with talent. It's a matter of who's going to filter out. I think it's going to be a team approach. There's not going to be one guy, especially early on, that filters himself up to the top. There's a lot of talent there. Brenton Cox, playmaker.
Yeah.
You saw it last year. Adam Anderson, towards the end of the season, was starting to come into his own. There's another guy that I like that I can't wait to see this season. It's Azeez Ojulari. Probably not one of your higher-rated recruits coming into this season.
Certainly compared to some of them.
Yes, I mean it's a bunch of five-star guys loaded up. But you watch him play; he's sneaky, and it's a talented group. And that's where you're going to see a lot of that sophomore surge.
Another defensive type guy you could say this about, and he was almost a freshman phenom a year ago. In some cases probably was. Tyson Campbell at cornerback was a starter for a while, was replaced by Eric Stokes before the end of the year. But after having spent a year learning in this program, he's also one of those guys that could make a big surge this season.
One of the reasons why I think he got the early nod last season was because of his talent. I mean, he's a naturally blessed athlete. Tyson Campbell can cover folks, and he's got the skills that to overcome some things that he might not have seen because of a lack of experience early on last season. But now that's changed. I mean, he's got a year under his belt, and you pair that with his God-given athletic ability. I mean, there's a lot to be excited about for his potential and what could be this season that he's looking at.
Let me do one more name here. It's on the other side of the ball. A lot of Georgia offensive linemen have been around for a while. They've gained some experience. But it's the guy who's probably got the least experience. Did start a game last year at Kentucky, but less than the others. That's the center, Trey Hill. My guess is Hill this season could also make a very big name for himself.
Great one to circle. Nobody really watches offensive line. They just want to see the holes that they create and the pockets that they create for Jake to throw beautiful passes from. But it starts in the middle with an offensive line. Yes, the tackles are probably easier to see. But Trey Hill plays a very pivotal role in that center spot, getting everybody on the same page, creating distance and space and outside run game, and then creating a firm pocket. So big leap expected. You lose one of the best in the SEC with Gilliard last year, and Trey Hill, he seems to have the chops to be able to step in and not lose a step, and possibly, in the long run, be one of the guys, an upgrade in a position that has been pretty firm in years past in the history of the University of Georgia.
Number one ranked recruiting classes, oftentimes a precursor to championship seasons. Georgia had one in 2018, and it could pay big dividends in 2019 as the Dogs hope to own the East again. Own the East is brought to you by Georgia's Own Credit Union. Make sure you check out georgiasown.org to find out how you can earn 1.25 points for every dollar earned on your Georgia's Own Visa Signature credit card. Also, Georgia's Own Credit Union celebrating 85 years in business with 85 acts of kindness. Find out more about that at georgiasown.org. Back here live at East Lake Country Club. Great stuff from John Stinchcomb there as part of our Own the East video series, courtesy of Georgia's Own Credit Union. Happy to be here now with Martin Stevenson, the tournament director for the Tour Championship. It comes up just 3 weekends from right now, the conclusion of the PGA Tour season. And what an event, Martin, this is going to be. And I can say, as someone who loves college football and also loves golf and the PGA Tour, the new date for this, for me, is so exciting. After having been in September, moving this up this year, kind of truncating the PGA Tour calendar, has created a lot of energy for golf this year, and a great way to conclude the season right before the college football season begins.
Brandon, you're exactly right. The new elevation of the PGA Tour schedule this year has just been phenomenal. Really now having a great cadence of global monster events, really beginning in March with the Players, ultimately culminating here at East Lake with the Tour Championship in August. For all those dog fans out there, we're so excited to now get ahead of Labor Day, get ahead of the start of the college football season. For us here in Atlanta, how lucky are we to be able to culminate the entire PGA Tour season, crown our FedEx Cup champion right here on the hallowed grounds of East Lake Golf Club, and then have the unofficial kickoff with the Chick-fil-A kickoff games for college football the weekend after.
Yeah, speaking of dog fans, there's actually a website you can go to. It's tourchampionship.com/DawgNation, and inside there's a promo code you can enter. It's DawgNation 2019, and you can get a discount on your tickets to be a part of this field. And if you've never been here to see this event, it's the 30 essentially the best golfers in the world. It's a great chance to get up close and personal with the guys that you see on TV all the time. Tiger Woods put on a big show a year ago. There's obviously, as we work our way through the playoffs over the course of the next couple of weeks, Liberty National this week in New York, the beautiful spot in Chicago the week after that. Also, a lot of those former UGA guys still in the mix for this as well. It could be a fun run through the playoffs for some of those names, Bubba Watson and others.
Exactly. Overall, we've actually got 19 players from the SEC represented in the top 125, as you mentioned, kicking off this week with the Northern Trust up at Liberty National Golf Club. Next week, that'll drop to the top 70 and ultimately the top 30. Making it here to Atlanta, to East Lake. Overall, we've got 6 Bulldogs in the top 125 competing this week. Kisner's probably at the top, the highest spot right now. I think it's 22nd. Bubba's sitting at 71, so we hope he plays well this week and gets into the BMW and ultimately makes it back here to Atlanta, where he's had a great track record here at East Lake.
I want to take a moment to say goodbye to our radio and podcast audience. Remind you, DawgNation Daily, we've had a great time here today at the East Lake Country Club, the site of the Tour Championship coming up in just a couple of weeks. Make sure you take advantage of the website we told you before, tourchampionship.com/DawgNation. You can get your discounted tickets to be a part of what's going to go down in a couple of weeks. I'll also remind you, speaking of rivals in the SEC, around here we believe Georgia's number one rivals, the Florida Gators. It has now been 1,012 days since Florida's beaten Georgia. We'll keep doing that as part of your Gator Hater Updater here on DawgNation Daily. Radio and podcast audience, we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks for being a part of DawgNation Daily. And back here on video, as we get ready to begin our R.S. Andrews cool down, Martin will continue to say that I'm incredibly excited about this event, and one of the things that you and I were talking about before we began was the fact that scoring for events like this is always tricky, right? Because you have the balance of, hey, you want to make this a good TV product for the people who tune in, but you also want to be fair to the golfers who've performed well over the course of the playoff season, who've earned their pecking order in the rankings heading into that playoff. And it seems like the Tour Championship has done a great job with that this year, where you won't have the situation like you had a year ago where, Tiger Woods is the one that everyone talks about, but it's actually Justin Rose who kind of takes home the big trophy and the big prize. This year there's a modification to the scoring, which is going to make watching the event fun, but also a little bit easier to understand who the big winner is when it's all said and done. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
Of course, and you're exactly right. In addition to the schedule change this year, the other big news is actually the competition adjustment to how we reset the system when the top 30 players make it here to Atlanta. So in previous years, you had mentioned, we did a reset on the points. And so it really gave every single player a mathematical shot at winning the FedEx Cup by winning the Tour Championship. Starting this year and moving forward, instead of a points-based reset, we're now going to go to a strokes-based reset. So now the top player in the FedEx Cup standing at the conclusion of the BMW Championship, as they come to Atlanta for the Tour Championship, will actually start at 10 under par. Second place will start at 8 under and work all the way down to players 26th through 30th, starting at even par. Now, what does that mean for the fans? Well, for the fans, it makes it as easy as possible to be able to follow the competition and know exactly where every player stands in the FedEx Cup standings and how this is all going to shape out on Sunday here on the 18th green. To put this in a real live example, last year we had Tiger Woods, phenomenal finish, made a par at the last to end up winning the tournament. Justin Rose won the FedEx Cup. But if we had been under the strokes base last year, that birdie putt that Tiger Woods had, which he ultimately lagged up and tapped in and the place went nuts and it was phenomenal, that birdie putt that he had would have actually been to tie Justin Rose and go into a playoff for the FedEx Cup.
One more thing I want to mention. You mentioned the cool opening kickoff games, especially here in Atlanta, taking place the following weekend. There's a neat tie-in between this event at East Lake and our friends over at the Chick-fil-A kickoff and everything else in terms of the connection that golf has with college football in this city, and that continues in this event there as well. I know the folks from the Chick-fil-A Bowl and the Chick-fil-A kickoff, the Peach Bowl, they've got a pretty good setup going on here for this tournament event that I think a lot of our viewers right now who are big college football fans, big Georgia fans, also big golf fans will enjoy hearing about too. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Of course, no. The Gary Stoker and the team of the Peach Bowl has been a phenomenal partner of the Tour Championship and has really been the catalyst to drive to create this college football atmosphere out at the golf course watching the top 30 players here at historic East Lake Golf Club. And we're happy to once again be delivering the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl College Corner experience, a wonderful hospitality venue that sits on the 9th green where we have tailgate-style menu. The Peach Bowl team brings out that college atmosphere. We encourage our fans to wear their college colors on Saturday. And it's just a $250 all-inclusive ticket with phenomenal views of the entire property. You can actually go to tourchampionship.com to learn a little bit more.
So tourchampionship.com for more information on that. Tourchampionship.com/DawgNation to find out how you can get your special ticket saved just for the dog fans that check in here on DawgNation Daily each and every day. We've got your comments coming up as part of our R.S. Andrews cool down. Before that, Martin Stevenson, thanks so much for being with us and really appreciate you being gracious host to us. It's so much fun to be out here with the par 3 15th right over here, the dramatic scene that kind of leads you to the conclusion here at this wonderful golf facility. It gets me excited about the tournament, and it's just a pleasure to talk a little golf and get ready for that with you here today.
We appreciate it, and thanks to DawgNation for coming out here and all the dog fans. We look forward to seeing you August 21st to the 25th for the Tour Championship.
That's Martin Stevenson, the Executive Director of the Tour Championship. We're glad to have you with us, Martin. We appreciate your time. I'll look forward to taking some of your comments right now on our Facebook and YouTube comment section, and we'll talk a little Georgia football here before we get a chance to sign off here today. In fact, give me a chance to go ahead and pull these up. We'll get Connor Riley to pop in here, too. You want to do some YouTube comments with us as well, Connor? Y'all have come to expect Connor Riley to be a part of the R.S. Andrews cool down, so we'll give you a chance to do some of that right now. In fact, do you have a YouTube comment ready to go for us?
Give me 2 seconds. The usual riffraff of the YouTube page.
Why are y'all always fighting and arguing on YouTube, by the way? Y'all got to stop doing that. We got to start enjoying each other's company a little bit more.
Brian Kephart has an interesting observation or comment. I think we don't even need Zeus against Notre Dame, but I agree. I think that's where he makes his name known on a national stage. I will say at practice yesterday, Zamir White was out there. They were in full pads. He did not have a knee brace on either knee. Maybe that's nothing. To me, that is kind of interesting that, they're going through full padded practices now and, he feels comfortable enough. And maybe it's because he just doesn't like the restriction that the knee brace gives him. But, it is another positive, little morsel sign that, he could be working his way back to full strength. And, Brian brings up a good point in that, Georgia shouldn't need Zamir White for the Vanderbilt game, for the Murray State game, for the Arkansas State game. But that Notre Dame game, I think, is one to watch, one where they, might pull the cover off the Ferrari, bypass the grocery store and just take it on the highway and rev it up to 150 miles an hour.
Let me just give you an alternate thought on that just for a moment, because I think what Brian says there makes a lot of sense. However, if you want to save him for health reasons, there's also the byproduct of all of a sudden now, the moment when you unveil him to the world, you are putting a little bit of extra butterflies in the stomach on that. Now, Zamir comes across the kind of guy that doesn't sweat too much of this kind of stuff too much, so he's probably not going to be all that affected by any of that, frankly. But there is something to be said for slowly acclimating him to college life, not to get him used to the contact and the wear and tear, but just so there's not all that extra emphasis, because the crowd's going to go crazy.
Yep.
If Zamir White gets in on 2nd 7, runs for 15 yards in the first series of the game against Notre Dame, the crowd is going to turn Sanford Stadium sideways. And while I love the idea of that energy, that is putting a lot of extra something, a little extra mustard on that, hot dog in that moment. And I guess the question is, how good of an idea is that one way or not?
Well, I'm working on a story here. I kid you not, every single time someone connected to the Georgia football program talks about Zamir White, they mention the same sort of rhetoric. We're excited to see him. He's worked so hard to get to this point. And I'm trying to sort of figure out where this excitement comes from, because the fans' perspective, that they're as excited to see him, just given he's a 5-star running back. Georgia loves their running backs. But, within the program, there's a real excitement to sort of see what he can actually do when he gets on the field, because, Ben Cleveland was telling us yesterday, last season before he hurt his knee in covering a punt, he was knocking guys around and just, ramming all over them on the practice field. So, they, I think from a season ago, were sort of excited to what this guy can do, and they're sort of carrying that excitement, and it's been bottled up, and it's ready to sort of to burst open over a year later.
On a different subject, Gary and Christian Gulisano in our Facebook comment section talking about Tyson Campbell. And, I have stuck by Campbell along the way, and I reckon right about now, just based on talking to you kind of off the show, off the record, I feel like sticking with Campbell is rewarded. Mm-hmm. I wrote about this for DawgNation.com, that playing as much as he did last year was going to be an important situation for him in trying to earn that starting job this year. I haven't seen or heard anything through these first few practices to change my mind about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much stock you should put into this, but, he's been running with Eric Stokes as the sort of first-team cornerbacks. He is a guy who he's got playing experience, and I think this year that's going to be really big for him, because you saw a season ago, some of that inexperience sort of hurt Campbell, and I think Kirby Smart now, he might be a little bit more hesitant to put a guy like a Tyreek Stevenson or a DJ Daniel who haven't, played and contributed at a big time level, to just sort of throw them out there right away. And I think so that carryover effect, and Campbell, he learned a lot from last season, I think. And when he did get back in the starting lineup against Texas due to DeAndre Baker skipping the game, he played a lot better in my opinion. And I think, he's someone, he just needs the reps, because he hadn't played cornerback really at all until his senior year of high school. So to really go from doing that for 1 year and then having to do that at a high level was a big ask, even for a guy as athletic and talented as Campbell is.
Michael Lifton brings up Zachary Evans about how long this commitment's going to go. I mentioned this during our regular show today. I want to say this and give all of you a chance to respond. I'm just speaking honestly here. I think what Georgia's doing is worth the effort. You got to go after Zachary Evans if you have a chance to get him. But speaking as a fan just for a moment, I'm not sure what I could hear that would make me want to high-five a fellow fan and say, Evans is in the bag for Georgia. There's plenty to believe that Lindbergh and Milton and all those guys were referencing Evans when they tweeted the other day. Jeff Sentell, as I said before, didn't necessarily throw water on that assessment when he joined us on DawgNation Daily yesterday as a part of our Marlowe's Tavern Insider Update. I got news for you. If Evans committed during our show, I'd still say this recruitment's not over. This is a contested battle that's going to stretch all the way to December at least. So, Connor, I don't know where that leaves me. I don't know how Georgia fans will respond to me on that. I'm glad that Georgia's going after him. I think it's cool that they're in the mix for it as much as they are. But I don't believe there's anything that could happen between now and December that would lead me to believe this is over, even a commitment.
I think if Zach Evans was to commit right now, you're so skeptical, you wouldn't even give your guffaw, your little chuckle, chortle, whatever we would decide to call it.
I'd be happy about it. Speaking as a fan, I'd be happy about it. I'd be glad that it occurred. This is not, to me, though, Kendall Milton, where I don't think there's any way Milton reconsiders his decision. This is not Keely Ringo, who I view as obviously publicly as an uncommitted prospect. I'll be shocked if Ringo doesn't come to Georgia. There are some 5-star recruits who don't take it all the way. Evans does not feel like one of those. I don't feel like this is a knockout punch you can throw before the ink is on the LOI.
Yeah, we were sort of talking about this before the show today. You're saying you're not ready until like the ink is on the paper, until Georgia sent out the tweet saying he's signed, the letter of intent is in. I'm not sure. I wouldn't feel comfortable about where Zach Evans is going until he steps on campus and there are pictures of him and you've got the documentation that he's enrolled in classes at Georgia on that first day and come January. It's going to be a long recruitment. We also sort of made references to, if Evans were to commit right now, it'd read a lot like John Emery Jr. did a year ago, where he commits, he committed late July. He commits, Georgia feels good about where they stand, and then not quite the 11th hour last year, but later on in the recruitment, he flips to a home state school, and I think we sort of share their sentiment of Texas A&M is just not going to let. If Texas A&M is going to become the program that Jimbo Fisher wants it to become,
Jim Fisher would be a very different guy.
Jim Fisher's your accountant. Jimbo Fisher is not going to let Zach Evans leave the state of Texas and go play outside of that at Kyle Field.
So what Barry Watkins says is, well, what happens if Georgia doesn't get Bigsby? Likely won't. What happens if Georgia? At least based on what's going to happen Friday, it doesn't look strong for Georgia with Bixby. What happens if Evans eventually goes elsewhere? What's left for Georgia? And here's where I think that Jeff Sintel's probably going to come in. In fact, I think we hear him echo a lot on Before the Hedges presented by Kroger on this point later on today. I think that it's reasonable to assume that if Georgia wanted to go full court press and flip Marshawn Lloyd from South Carolina, I think that'd take about 7 minutes. Flipping Bigsby from Auburn, that may be a slightly different scenario. But Malzahn's job is very much in jeopardy right now. It's not a given that Malzahn coaches that team in 2020, which could make flipping Tank Bigsby an easy thing to potentially do. I mean, I guess then you also start getting into the, I know Jeff mentioned Don Chaney Jr. yesterday. It's interesting to hear Jeff mention him because Chaney, by his own words, wasn't even
said he was done.
Sometimes you believe that, sometimes you don't. Does that leave room for like a Jace McClellan or somebody like that? Do you even want somebody like that? I don't know, but I'm guessing, Barry, you're going to hear Jeff Sintel start saying a lot about that this is not am I using the phrase right? This is not a zero-sum game where you either get Evans or you get nobody. Yeah. If you don't get Evans, you might have a chance to come back in and get another back. However, honesty compels me to admit that's exactly what Georgia tried a year ago, and it did not work. Yeah. I mean, with the exception of Kenny McIntosh, who they were going to take no matter what.
Right, who's a good running back, and Georgia needed to have him anyway for running back depth. You bring this up a lot. If you're investing all these resources in Evans, it means you're not investing them elsewhere. And I do think Evans is worth it, and I've written this before. Sometimes when you go deep sea fishing and you go try to get that 300-pound marlin, sometimes you just come up empty, and that's, recruiting. But, Georgia's won enough battles and is going to continue to win enough battles to sort of get those guys. I think the interesting thing, and I don't know how many people have looked ahead to this, but the running back class next year is nowhere near as strong as this running back class is. And, Georgia's obviously, they're going to take a running back every year because it's just the way they churn out. And the fact that after 2021, White and Cook, there's a chance both those guys are ready to go. So, they're going to have to probably take, there's a real chance, they're going to, if they don't get Evans this year, they're going to have to try and land even more running backs next year. And so while Jeff is sometimes fond of saying, well, you don't get someone in 2020, it means you can just get someone in 2021. I think getting multiple running backs is going to be hard every year. So you might as well just address that issue now.
What's that gif of the Mets fan? That's how I feel about waiting to 2021 to get an elite tight end or an elite running back. Let me do one more comment here on Facebook. And while I'm doing that, Connor, if you want to find a couple YouTubes to go there as well.
So Green Soldier's got something that I think is near and dear to your heart. And you, as the chief Gator hater, might be able to explain sort of where this is coming from. Because I actually think you understand that program better than most Florida fans do. Green Soldier, who I had the pleasure of meeting at our Brasstown event last week, was an absolute pleasure to meet him. Great guy. He asked, where is this hype from Florida coming? You mentioned yesterday, I think Sports Illustrated had him in the top 10. A lot of people are sort of looking at them as a trendy team. And I think he, like a lot of other Georgia fans, is sort of skeptical of, what can this Florida team really do?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I want to be as fair and balanced as I possibly can. I think most of, at least the educated opinions regarding Florida, because there is an uneducated prediction involving Florida that we'll get to in a moment. But the educated opinions that tout Florida are going to do this based on two reasons. You can look at some examples of Dan Mullen as coach at Mississippi State, not necessarily in always getting wins, but at least against the spread, has been a good in-game coach. There's some numbers to back that up. The other number that Florida potentially has on its side is the amount of returning talent it has by percentages of yards and tackles and all the different ways you measure productivity. There is a pretty large percentage of that returning for Florida this season. Now, here's my retort and my rebuttal to that. That while Mullen has a history of being a pretty good in-game coach, covers the spread a lot over the course of his final 5 years at Mississippi State, won as a point spread underdog 9 times, that success has never really extended to Kirby Smart. As defensive coordinator at Alabama, Smart typically got the best of him, even compared to the point spread. In other words, doing better than the experts assumed that he probably would defensively against Mullen's offense. Head-to-head matchups the last 2 years, with Mullen at Mississippi State, blowout in Athens. 19-point win for Georgia in Jacksonville a year ago. So I don't buy the whole idea of Mullen as an in-game coach, because against the opponent that matters most for him, that hasn't really showed up. The other thing is, I think this is the fundamental flaw that prognosticators make about college football all the time. They assume that an average player gets better because he's a year older. If you give me the choice of inexperienced talent or an experienced guy who's kind of midland average, as we like to say in the South, I'm going to take the inexperienced talent every day of the week. The Georgia roster, I believe, is head and shoulders above the Florida one right now. The other part of this, the other kind of thing that's out there, there's a certain segment of the media who's no more educated than your average fan, who just assumes it's time for Florida to be good again. That orange helmet's been on TV for 30 years. They just assume it's time for Florida to rise back to the top. That somehow the DNA that Spurrier had, that Meyer had, that somehow Mullen inherits that because he has the same job. And frankly, I think that's false. I think it's also false at Georgia as well. Just because this is the program that Herschel Walker once ran for doesn't mean a current running back is going to be any better than he would for another program. Now, it just so happens that Georgia's brought in plenty of good running backs, but you don't inherit the ghosts of a previous program. And so that's what part of this is when it comes to Florida there as well. I'll say this again. Their preseason top 10 team, Florida will finish unranked, and I'll keep saying that because I want it to be clear. That's my opinion on the record.
To go in a completely different direction, but I think it's one that's going to make you happy. We've got some fresh online chatter.
Ooh, let's do it.
So you know who Caleb Williams is, right?
Of course, 2021 quarterback. 5-star
quarterback, #1 dual threat in the country out of Washington, D.C. area.
He's also a guy that I have very quickly talked myself into over the course of the last few weeks. I probably wasn't ready to talk 2021 quarterbacks a couple of months ago. Then somebody started showing me some video of Mr. Williams running and throwing. I'm ready to talk about 2021 quarterbacks now.
Earlier this morning, Mr. Williams tweeted, August 30th is going to be a special day. Wink emoji.
No doubt. Are you serious? That's a game changer.
End of the month, you get your first 2021 commitment, and it's a 5-star to boot, and a quarterback who can be sort of the leader of the class. You'll love to see it, if it were to happen.
I mean, listen, I've only been watching this partially, but, I mean, most of the online folks would say that Williams is probably a Georgia lead right now, right?
Yeah, the crystal balls, which, again, trust those as you will, seem to indicate that, Georgia is the guy to go. Georgia is in the driver's seat with his commitment.
This is also a top 15 player in the country, right?
Yes, per the 247 composite, I believe he's the number 12 overall prospect, and it's a very deep quarterback class next year as well. I think there's something like four quarterbacks, including Williams, in the top 15. Brock Vandagriff is a guy who I'm sure a lot of Georgia fans would have liked to have seen play at Georgia, just given he lives about 20 minutes from Sanford Stadium. But landing Williams, a 5-star quarterback, especially that dual threat guy, because I know that's what excited a lot of Georgia fans about Justin Fields, just having a true dual threat, real athlete at the position. That's something that, you get that weekend. So let's say Williams commits on Friday, and then you get that Vanderbilt game on Saturday. It's Labor Day weekend, it could shape up to be a really special weekend for this Georgia football program.
That's really good stuff. I'm glad you shared that on the show. Matt Rukavina said, BA, did you see Hudson Mason, the former Georgia quarterback, comment on Feinbaum yesterday, said lack of returning talent might cost us 2 games. Matt says, I get being objective, but that's just flat negative. So here's my belief. I don't think a former Georgia player has an obligation to always talk up Georgia. I don't feel that way at all, and I also don't care all that much about objectivity either. You see plenty of guys on ESPN right now across the various sporting spectrums that don't have any pretense of being objective. So I think for the most part, objectivity is kind of overrated. However, just the basic facts of what Mason said there, and I didn't hear this, but if those are the facts, I just think that's flat wrong. Y'all, the biggest advantage that Georgia has in its pursuit of a national championship is that it's created such a gap between most of the teams that it plays in the regular season. The only two games right now that Vegas, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Connor, the only two games right now that Vegas sees as even reasonably close, they do admittedly have the Florida point spread a lot closer than I would have, and they've got the Auburn point spread hovering somewhere around a touchdown. That could all change during the season, but those are about the only two games this year where I expect Georgia, at least based on the way it's on paper right now, to be less than a 10-point favorite. You have a massive, massive advantage. I don't care if you've got 17-year-old kids. When you've got that kind of talent advantage going in, that takes a lot of freshman blunders to close the gap in a game like that.
Well, and I would just, to push, and Hudson was a really good quarterback in his, 1+ year as a starter at Georgia. When Georgia plays those tough games, those tough November games against Florida that you mentioned, Auburn, Texas A&M, I've mentioned Missouri as a game a lot. Those are going to be their 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th games of the year. Inexperience will not be a reason they lose those games. By that point, they'll have been through some wars. It's not like the LSU game last year. It was the 5th or 6th game of the season. It was the first time in a real true road test that year. They're going to have been through some opposing stadiums by that point. They're going to have played in some big-time environments. So unless Hudson is insinuating that Georgia's going to lose to Notre Dame, because that's a game maybe, the experience could theoretically get the best of them, because a lot of these young guys will have not played necessarily in a home atmosphere like that at Sanford, and that could, maybe overjuice them up a little bit. But, inexperience, I don't think inexperience is why they're going to is a reason they're going to lose one of these games. Green Soldier asked us earlier, what's your biggest position of concern? For me, it's just defensive line, and I just don't know how talented that group ultimately is just in terms of its long-term ceiling. I could see that being a reason they lose a game because that defensive line gets pushed around, but inexperience is not one of those reasons.
All right, before I get caught in the hypocrisy, let me address Gary and Christian Gudasana, who says, yeah, but BA, you've been saying, because I talked before about how inexperienced talent is better than an average player getting a year older, and you said, and Gary and Christian come back to say, yeah, but BA, you've been concerned about wide receiver, and I'm the one that's been saying these guys are inexperienced but talented. I'll say two things in response to that because it's a fair point to bring up. Statistically speaking, there are plenty of guys who've crunched these numbers over the years. Statistically speaking, wide receiver has been a position where experience has mattered a little bit more. And so it's one of the reasons why I'll be slightly more concerned about wide receiver than I might be at another position. Believe it or not, it's been shown that receiver returning talent might matter more than quarterback and offensive line, two spots where you really assume that experience would matter. The numbers don't necessarily back that up. But also beyond that, when I talk about my issues with the Georgia wide receiver core, what I still need to see from this group for the rest of the summer and heading towards the start of the season, I'm also talking about the national championship standard. Georgia can beat up on its 12 regular season opponents with wide receiver play as good as it was a year ago. With all due respect to Riley Ridley, Terry Godwin, and McCole Hardman, they're not going to win a national championship without an upgrade from that position group. Right. So I'm actually grading the wide receivers right now for Georgia on a pretty harsh curve, simply because that's what I think a national championship is going to require.
Right, and that's not to say that by the end of the season, a guy like Tyler Simmons, a guy like Demetrius Robertson, Blaylock and Pickens, guys we've talked about at length. It's not to say that they can't sort of be difference makers. Riley Ridley in that national championship game 2 years ago came out of nowhere and ended up being probably the best wide receiver on the field that day in terms of stats and productions and the impact he made. Obviously, Devonta Smith caught the big touchdown that game. But, Georgia has now accumulated, a star level in terms of just raw and natural talent to where they have guys who, they may not need to play a whole lot as long as they sort of understand the Georgia playbook and they can get thrust into a game and be a real difference maker for this program. And, even you look at a team like Alabama last year, no one was talking about Jalen Waddle at the beginning of the season, but when those two teams, Alabama and Georgia, met, in my opinion, that wide receiver core, he was the biggest difference maker in that game because Georgia just did not have a guy who could keep up with him. And, that's something that they found out over the course of the season. I think Georgia's going to need to do the same with some of their young-ish wide receivers this year.
So Bruce Eklund brings up a good point that when I talk bad about Florida, this is not just me throwing red meat to my constituency. I'm not making a political speech, in other words. As Bruce pointed out on this show 2 years ago, I picked Auburn to win the SEC West. I took a lot of heat from Georgia fans when I said that because Georgia fans don't want Auburn to be any better than they want Florida to be. I do try to call them like I see them, right down the middle.
Yeah. Is there any way, Florida and Auburn could both go like 8-4. A disappointing like 8-4 this year. That way, like Mullen and Malzahn keep their jobs. But like
I don't know that 8-4 keeps Malzahn's job. He may need a scalp this year.
if they're 8-4, but they lose to Georgia and Alabama at the end of the year, it probably won't be enough.
The other thing you got to watch out for him, though, is 2 other coaches getting him fired. Now, I know they've done, you've got Ed Orgeron and Jimbo Fisher, who right now, I believe, look like they're building something. If I had to bet on the future of those 3 programs right now, Auburn is the one I'd take the least in compared to the other 2, and I didn't expect to be saying that. LSU, I think, has really built itself up pretty well in the last year and a half or so. I think that, I know y'all always get mad at me when I talk up Jimbo Fisher. I just think he's a better coach than some of y'all do. Some of y'all just don't like Fisher at all, and I understand some of that kind of stuff, but I think he's also potentially building something at Texas A&M. So I know they've got the losing streaks against Alabama and Georgia contend with, or at least the imbalance in those 2 rivalries, maybe more so than an actual streak. But I believe it's Jimbo and Orgeron that could eventually get Malzahn fired.
Could you believe if I had told you a year ago that you'd be saying what you just said about Orgeron right now?
No, this is an about face for me, I
thought Orgeron was going to get fired at the end of last year.
I hate to be inconsistent on this because it's obviously easier to follow if I say the same thing year after year after year. But I'll tell you, I still don't know if Ed Orgeron is a good coach, but he's running a heck of a program right now, and I cannot stand the thought of John Emery Jr. rushing for 1,000 yards as a freshman, but I believe it's probably going to happen.
And as far as Jim Fisher, I'll be interested to see how that Texas A&M fan base sort of interacts with him. If they, let's say they do lose to Georgia, Alabama, and Clemson. They go 9-3 in the regular season. That assumes that they beat Auburn and they beat LSU, which are not givens at all, especially because they have to go to LSU the week after going to Georgia this year. I do wonder if, things don't go well for Jim, or go, as well as a lot of people like you and I sort of think they can go this year, sort of what the flavor is on Jimbo at the end of the year, just given, especially, how a lot of people perceive he ended things at Florida State with leaving that program in a real dumpster. I do wonder if maybe, come the end of the season, our perception on Jimbo and sort of what he has to do at Texas A&M has changed a little bit.
Let me let you find a couple of YouTube comments to go out on. I also want to reference Joel Moody here, who said, Jimbo Fisher's a fast talker. Never trust a fast talker unless it's BA. So true. Fisher is a bit of a fast talker. Heaven knows I am. The only thing I hope is, I know especially in the sunshine, you can kind of see this, my hair's thinning every year. I hope I don't get to the point where I'm like Jimbo Fisher with like that Mikhail Gorbachev like thing in the front of your hair. I hope that's not where this is all going. And I realize I date myself by referencing the former Russian premier.
Yeah, and Memphis Dog, going back to Orgeron, he brings up, keeping Dave Aranda around for this long and not sort of letting him either go to a big-time college job or go even to the NFL, I think has been a real win for him. I'll be interested to see, what happens with offense this year because they've cycled through offensive coordinators now under him. And if things don't work there again and they sort of just scrap everything mid-year like they did with Matt Canada, and, next offseason, we heard all about Joe Brady this offseason. Next offseason will be some other name connected to Louisiana State. I wonder if that's going to ultimately handicap their ceiling. And how you mentioned Kirby has a lot, you think Kirby has a lot of influence on, play calls and how that team is run. I wonder, too, if Orgeron is going to react that way and sort of if he's going to have to learn how to loosen his grip of how that LSU offense should be run.
I think that's really interesting. And Memphis Dog's point also gets me to dovetail into something that's always on my mind. One of the arguments we've had over the years, and I mean lowercase letter arguments because I don't feel that passionately about it, and I understand the people who argue the other point of view. I've said before, I don't care as much about facilities as some fans do or seemingly some boosters do. The media loves writing about facilities. I'll never understand why commercial real estate gets as much coverage in college football media as it does, but that's just kind of what's out there. When it comes to the piles and piles of money that Georgia's collecting, the thing I hope to see the program use that money on is when one day Georgia has a coordinator of a Dave Aranda caliber. And to be frank, it hasn't had one of those yet. Mel Tucker was a good coach. He's replaceable. Jim Chaney, I don't think he's as bad as some of y'all do, but he's clearly replaceable. One of these days, and it may be one of the current two, it may really be James Coley. He may be influential enough. It may be Dan Lanning, who is just a missile star on the rise. I can't wait to see Georgia in a position where it needs to pony up to keep a guy, to keep him from taking the Colorado State job, for instance. I can't wait to see Georgia in a position where it needs to pay a coordinator $2 million to keep him, because at that point in time, that's when I want to see Georgia really, really money whip its opposition.
Well, and I think you've sort of seen Georgia do this. Obviously, not on the $2 million level like LSU has with position coaches. There's Sam Pittman, I believe, is the highest or second highest paid offensive line coach in the country, and they've been willing to re-up every year, every time it seems like there's been a threat that someone might lure him away. I think Del McGee is another name to watch as well. I wrote a story on him this past weekend, and Kirby says, when he's away or when he's off doing stuff, that's what takes him away from the Georgia program. McGee is the guy, interestingly enough, he leaves in charge of the program. And I think some smart team someday will decide, even though he is technically a running backs coach, we're just going to have him skip the whole offensive coordinator thing completely and hire him as a head coach. And I think,
It's like a John Harbaugh thing from the NFL.
Right, yeah. So I do wonder how long Georgia can keep on to those guys. Because McGee and Pittman are, I think, pretty clearly 1 and 2 in terms of, how well they recruit their positions and the guys they recruit. And, that's something that Kirby has said. They've been a real asset to this Georgia program.
You have a final YouTube comment to go out on here?
Chris Singletary, Free Seafood University, Florida State.
Not bad at all. I'll accept that. Although our buddy Nicole, who's here with us today, she won't like the FSU badge.
Here's a real one. Devin Glenn on YouTube. Pickens will be playing a significant role by Notre Dame. He may not start, but he will be getting targets.
I believe that's probably true. I think that, I love practice reports as much as anybody does. And when, you or Mike are writing about the pecking order for the drills, I want to read that because that's the only thing we have to read right now. I don't put a single stock into that because if you believe that, you'd be led to believe that Dominic Blaylock's the 5th string receiver or something like that. We just know that's not going to be the case. The other question I have about George Pickens and a lot of these Georgia players, do you think they practice this thing where they're always photographed like holding their bicep like this? I mean,
they're taught to hold the ball high and tight, and I just wonder if they're taking it a step further. High, tight, and flex.
It also has, go look at our, galleries and stuff like that we put up at DawgNation or really any of our stories involving these guys. It was Elijah Holyfield last year. It's been a lot of these guys this year where they're always running like this that they make sure to get those biceps in the picture.
Oh, yeah. They always know where the cameras are.
Why not? I'll say this. Pickens has 2 touchdowns against Notre Dame.
Ooh, look at you. I would say that as an actual bold prediction.
Why not? We're having a good time right here on the patio at East Lake. All right, we're going to get ready to sign off for now. Let me say thank you to R.S. Andrews. I could use my friends, Dari and the team over there at R.S. Andrews right now because as beautiful as it is here at East Lake Country Club, it's also really, really hot right now. So I'm going to get in the shade and get cooled off. If your house, though, does not offer you that kind of reprieve, well, check out my friends at R.S. Andrews and their $99 Smiley tune-up. They'll get your air conditioning unit back to factory fresh specs, and it's only $99. They call it the Smiley tune-up because story after story, R.S. Andrews has been delivering smiles for a whole long time. We're going to be back here again at East Lake over the course of the next couple of weeks. I will invite you to check out the website we gave you before, tourchampionship.com/DawgNation. Get your discounted tickets to be a part of the Tour Championship coming up as we close out the PGA Tour season. Also, huge thanks to our friends at the AJC for being a part of our show every day. Make sure you get your Atlanta news now at AJC.com. Being out here today, it was kind of funny. There's all kinds of really cool memorabilia and paraphernalia inside the East Lake Clubhouse. I had a chance to walk around and look at a lot of that kind of stuff a little earlier. The Bobby Jones collection. I know he was a jacket, but that's still a revered figure when it comes to the golfing scene here. Seeing all that was really cool. I also sat on the patio a little earlier and took a moment to read the piece from Steve Hummer at AJC.com about another revered figure in golf trying to get back to this spot to do what he did a year ago. Really good piece from Hummer involving Tiger Woods. Now, he could conclude this 2019 golf campaign after winning the Masters in April and having some shaky, spotty play after that. So make sure you check that out and all of your Atlanta news now right there at AJC.com. I'm back in the studio later on for Before the Hedges presented by Kroger. We'll talk about Caleb Williams, Zachary Evans, and every other big name when it comes to recruiting. And from the friendly confines of our DawgNation World Headquarters studios again tomorrow for another episode of DawgNation Daily. I hope to see you there.